This ninth plague, the plague of darkness itself, is shrouded in a kind of darkness. What is this plague doing here? So far there have been 8 plagues of increasing intensity. The Nile turning blood red, and the frogs are omens more than anything else. The gnats and the flies are uncomfortable, but really not so serious. The plague that kills the livestock only affects animals, but not human beings. Boils are also a discomfort, and a more serious one. Hail and locusts destroy the Egyptian grain, so now there isn't any food. And on the horizon is the death of the firstborn. So we'd expect the 9th plague to be something that would at least threaten to take human life, but what we read seems like a bit of an anticlimax. And I quote, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Stretch out your hand toward the sky so that darkness will spread over Egypt, a darkness that can be felt.' So Moses stretched out his hand toward the sky, and total darkness covered all Egypt for 3 days. No one could see anyone else or leave his place for 3 days." The words darkness that can be felt suggest that what probably happened was a chamsin, a sandstorm. So that's a storm that would hide the light of the sun, and for as long as 3 days. And a chamsin usually blows in from the Sahara Desert. At the worst, a chamsin is usually the first of the season, which arrives in March. And this actually fits well with its placement as plague number 9, just before the death of the firstborn on Pesach. So while the 9th plague was a miracle, it wasn't something unknown to the Egyptians then or even now. So why is it placed just before the climax of the story of the plagues? The answer might be found in a line from the Dayenu. If God had executed judgment against the Egyptians, but hadn't done so against their gods, it would have been enough for us. The Torah itself refers to this 2 times. So not all the plagues were directed against the Egyptians. Some were directed specifically against their gods. For example, the Nile River was a god. Offerings were made to it at times of inundation, and the inundations themselves were attributed to the god Osiris. The plague of frogs would have been associated with the goddess Heket, who was believed to attend at the births of the Egyptians as a midwife, and who was a woman with the head of a frog. All this would have been immediately apparent to the Egyptians. So 2 things now become clear. The first is why the Egyptian magician said, "This is the finger of God," only after the plague of lice. Because the first 2 plagues wouldn't have surprised the Egyptians at all. They would have understood them as angry deities taking vengeance against the nation. The second thing is, these miracles weren't intended to demonstrate the power of the God of Israel. Rather, their meaning is moral. They represent the most fundamental ethical principle of them all. That is, those who shed the blood of humans by humans shall their blood be shed. When Pharaoh commanded every Israelite boy who is born must be cast into the Nile, he transformed Egyptian symbols of life, the Nile, which is so essential for agriculture, and the midwives, into agents of death. The river that turned to blood and the frogs that infested the land were coded messages that said, "See what it feels like when the gods you turned against the Israelites turn against you." And thus the 10th plague. The first 2 plagues were symbols of the murder of the Israelite children. The 10th plague was actual retribution. It was God saying, "You committed or passively accepted the murder of innocent children. And there's really only one way you'll ever realize the wrong that you did, and that is if the same thing happens to you." This helps explain the difference between the 2 words the Torah uses to describe what God does in Egypt. Otot umoftim, signs and wonders. They actually describe 2 very different things. A mofet, a wonder, is a real miracle. An ot, a sign, is something else. It's a symbol or a message. So what's the real significance of the plague of darkness? The greatest god in Egypt is Ra, the sun god. The name of the pharaoh associated with the Exodus is Ramses II, and the name Ramses means son of the god Ra. Egyptians actually believed that Pharaoh was a divine being, a child of the sun god. Thus the plague of darkness wasn't really a mofet, a miracle, but rather an ot, or sign. The obliteration of the sun meant there's a power in the universe mightier than Ra, the sun god, more powerful than Pharaoh, the son of Ra, and much greater than a civilization capable of swallowing entire peoples and murdering their children. When God told Moses to tell Pharaoh, "My son, my firstborn is Israel," he was saying, "I'm the God who cares for his children, not one who kills them." The 9th plague was an ot, or sign, that said there's not just physical darkness, but also a darkness that can be felt, a moral darkness. The best test of a civilization always comes down to the same thing. How does that civilization treat its most vulnerable members? More particularly, how does it treat children, its own children, as well as those of others? In the age in which we live, an age of child soldiers, suicide terrorism, and the use of children as the spoils of war, this remains the ultimate test of how civilized a civilization really is. Shabbat Shalom.